Hi, Nate.
Hey, Tom.
Have you heard about the friars who were behind on their belfry payments?
No.
No. So there were some friars who were cash strapped on these payments. So they opened up a small flower shop to raise funds. And, everybody in town, they liked, if they had a choice, they would rather buy flowers from men of God. So that's what quickly they became market dominant. But there was a rival florist across town who was upset about this, understandably. He asked these friars to shut down. They wouldn't do it. So he took matters in his own hands, hired the local fixer, Hugh McTaggart, the roughest and most vicious thug in town, to make these friars an offer that they couldn't refuse. So Hugh beat them up, trashed their store, said he'd be back if they ever tried to pull this shit again. So of course the friars had no choice. They were terrified. They closed up shop. And of course what that tells us yet again is that Hugh and only Hugh can prevent florist friars.
Wow. I really didn't know where this was going, but this is probably one of our better ones. Welcome to the retort. We're not talking about forest fires, unfortunately. We are talking about AI, and it's been a busy week. I don't know. We'll see how much reading Tom has done, how much explaining.
Different kind of fire.
A different kind of fire, yeah. I mean, it's ongoing today. We're recording on Wednesday the 21st. The next flurry of releases are coming. People in AI love to release things on the same day. Last week we had the OpenAI Sora model, which you've probably heard about in all sorts of podcasts. If you listen to one AI podcast, we assume you probably listen to a couple. We're not going to go through the technical details in too much detail. It's awesome. We'd had Gemini shipping a new model. Today we had what really is a new Gemini model called Gemma, which is Google shipping an open source model, but all signs indicate that it is like a training run from Gemini or like the same infrastructure. They're like, okay, let's open source it for the fans, so to say. let's give the people what they want, which I think it's good that Google's doing that again. We'll talk about that. And we'll see. There's plenty of other topics if we run out of time. But I think Sora is the one that fits best for our general theme, which is like AI's breaking the world. And what does it mean? And then I think there's a lot of different takes in Sora. I don't know. Like, what is your starting point when you see realistic text to video, Tom? Like what do you think about society in this? Like, I don't think copyright is the thing. There's lots of little issues. Like, copyright isn't really the thing. Like, people losing their jobs. Like, yes, that's important, but we've seen that as a society en masse before. Like reallocation of talent and labor is a thing that is accompanied in technological revolutions. But I think the social fabric, like we were talking about, the metaverse is wild.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, at a high level, my thoughts really aren't that different than what they have been for some time, which is this is about supply chains. And so people will look to reskill, whether you're creative or whether you're, related in some other way to video production or marketing across the supply chain. So this is a tool. It's a very powerful tool in this toolbox, but it's not clear to me, even from the videos that I've seen, that it's not like this is going to automate the entertainment industry overnight, right? It's maybe worth keeping in mind, if the question is like, what does this mean for society? My recollection of the SAG strikes, the actor strikes that were going on, or it feels like ancient history, honestly.
Yeah, I should have waited until now.
Yeah, well, in that case, though, I think it's a different cut, right? Because, of course, that was a larger, Hollywood has its own dynamics, which this is an AI podcast, but we're not trying to treat everything like a nail and AI is the hammer. That strike happened for lots of reasons, Hollywood has its own kind of like multi-decade cycle when this stuff gets relitigated. Part of it, though, was related to the fact that studios, understandably, have been interested in moving on, getting to this kind of business model where you're a day player, you're an extra. They give you $50 to scan your likeness, 3D scan, and then they never need you again because they own your likeness, or at least the version they scanned, and then they can just put you into the background of any Marvel movie, any like whatever mass crowd scene they need. And that's like, they don't need to keep hiring you. And that frankly does break the back of a lot of the entertainment industry, because the whole basis for the union is that it protects those kinds of people. There are these very, very, very radical, extreme power laws of talent and whatnot that define the movie industry, where there's like a few, very, very few major celebrities at the tippy top who we all know. You have their image in your head and you know their names. But then there's like many, 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 many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, who you'll never know who those people are. But so much of the entertainment industry is built on top of those people, whether they're in front of the camera or behind the camera. And I think because there is so much human resources behind getting anything worth watching off the ground at scale, there will be plenty of opportunities to reskill or redistribute that labor, even in the context of a tool that's seemingly magical, like video generation from text, because that does feel magical.
People, like, they could have their livelihood. They're not going to get redistributed at 1-to-1 though. Like, they could be lower relative compensation, and I think that's why people are like the compensation essentially gets skimmed by the tool that's providing the leverage. And if the leverage is the fact that you could generate a ton of videos really easily, OpenAI will take a bigger cut than what used to be the people trained in the arts.
Yeah,
this is all hypothetical, but I think that's why it's like where the argument.
It's definitely not 1-to-1. Yeah, I would. It's definitely not going to be a 1-to-1 reallocation or reskilling. History tells us that that's like never.
There will be
almost
few people
never happened.
that go like 1-to-100 by designing their workflow for new tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what it's likely to do is take an already very stratified industry and make it even more stratified in terms of talent, in terms of skills.
What do you think about outside of Hollywood? Because I think a lot of this is like, I was on the record saying I don't think the general public has access before the election, given how it's likely that people would easily be able to keep jailbreaking whatever filters OpenAI has and generate propaganda for the presidential election. Like, do you think that's a ridiculous take, or do you think OpenAI will actually give people access? What do we have, 8 months? I think that's about... They didn't launch GPT-4 or announce GPT-4, but they were doing safety for a really long time. So, like, I don't know if they take the same playbook for every model, which is like, it's ready to go. We'll roll it out in a couple months, or if they're just going to keep this locked down because the internet's not ready to deal with this. Like,
I mean, I'd rather not play the game of predicting what I think OpenAI is or is not going to do here. I think we kind of act like there's kind of they're as reactive, I think, as the rest.
I mean, what
of
should
us are.
they do?
I mean,
don't predict them.
What should they do?
You're now on the spot. You have to make the decision of like, you could give this access to people. Like, should they, as a member of society, should they give people access to the model, understanding that there's going to be a lot of political propaganda made with this? Like,
so like, it reminds me
not release it.
An interesting kind of anecdote comes into my head here that I think is relevant, where, so like, if you talk to sociologists who study why there are mafias or how you explain the existence of a mafia, the consensus explanation is that mafias arise, in other words, organized crime. Okay, what does it take for crime to become organized? And the answer, on one level is unsurprising, which is that there is an unreliable or non-existent police force due to the fact that there's like insufficient state control or regulation or oversight of some market in particular. And so a mafia arises sort of to act as a kind of pseudo-state, a pseudo-regulator for some market, right? That's why the mafia in America had this giant heyday during Prohibition, racketeering. The government made something illegal that didn't make demand for it go away. And so there was a supply chain that needed to be secured, and people stepped in to do it. Most famously Al Capone, lots of other people around the country, of course. But there are implications behind that are interesting, which is whenever there is an enormous amount of demand for some tool or service that the government is not really quite in a confident position to regulate or oversee, That doesn't mean that there isn't also a parallel need for rules to determine what acceptable or safe or even reliable use, right, of like whatever that tool or service is, right? So a lot of what these mafia folks were doing, like in Chicago in the 1920s, actually a lot of it was like making sure that it was safe to drink, you know, because they didn't want people getting blind when they drank some like moonshine or shit like that, right? Like they really were kind of functioning almost as like a Italian American FDA that it was just sort of their job. So I'm getting to your question here. What should OpenAI do? Basically, what we need is someone to be a source for either being able to control access to the product in such a way that there is no possible use of it that could not be vouched for. My read of that is that that's probably unlikely to be achieved, or I'm skeptical that it can be. Or that there's some kind of very stringent oversight over the people or the contexts in which these kinds of capabilities can be used. So if OpenAI did nothing, I think the state, in other words, the US government, I guess the federal government, would have to step in with new kinds of, at least suggestions, if not actual like required regulations, saying something like there's a major fine for the use of this technology, especially if it's on to mimic specific people.
I mean, there is
any kind of election specific stuff.
There's an example that's relevant. Did you see the whole Air Canada snafu with like a chatbot?
No, is that
they had
no.
They were using chatbots in customer support, and the customer support made up a refund policy, and then a court said that this LLM chatbot refund policy had to be held accountable to. So they ended up having to pay this customer this type of thing. So like,
they did have to pay the customer. That's interesting.
In this case, it's a lot easier because this is more of a like monetary transaction. I think in terms of reputations and things, like the FTC can say that imitating people is illegal for phone spam, but that's not going to mean people aren't going to do it. Like there's a difference between like on the record and off the record.
That's like prohibition.
Enforcement.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. So either way, I think either way there will be enforcement. So what should OpenAI do? Look, honestly, I'm not sure I trust OpenAI to be the gatekeeper for that enforcement. I would rather it be somebody else. I would rather the government step up here because I think there are kinds of enforcement that could be done that, if done right, would work or at least be well motivated. If OpenAI does it, they ought to do it in pretty close consortium with what the feds are expecting or wanting from this stuff. I don't think it should be done unilaterally by industry.
I just think what does enforcement look like to you? Like I think what this means is somebody's going to make an OpenAI account. They're going to bypass the OpenAI like safety filters. They're going to generate some ridiculous video of Trump or Biden like freaking croaking because they're old, like some old person propaganda, and then they're going to like post it online, and their account will be like what's going to happen is this person's account can get shut down. Like, is OpenAI's terms of service enforceable and like political penalties? Like I don't really know how I see enforcement actually happening other than like terms of service level, which terms of service are not really binding contracts in law.
Well, let me clarify my stance here. If OpenAI is going to do anything, they need to not do it alone. But my true preference would be that OpenAI actually does nothing. Because I think, and the reason I think that is, that's where I was going with that original analogy, which is actually some prominent sociologists who I respect at the height of so there was this murder increase that happened in the United States in urban cities quite infamously that I think was elevated over the course of the 80s and 90s in particular. It then finally started to level off, but there was there was 2 decades or so when it was precipitously increasing, and no one really understood why, and no one really understood what to do about it. And it got so bad that some social scientists, it's bad when a social scientists who are not economists are brought in to try and make sense of a problem. And in this case, there was one in particular, Randall Collins, whose work was a big influence on me during my early development, I guess. And he famously said that it would actually be better. The state could either spend many billions of dollars, just entirely reprioritizing public safety and hiring tens of thousands of police officers to make it so that crime could be more easily, monitored, prevented, whatever have you. Or it could actually take a step back and deliberately do nothing. And it would be really bad for a little bit of time, but then eventually you'd see a mafia.
Yeah, then everyone has.
And a mafia would effectively serve as a kind of private enforcer.
It's like, do you think the general public is like actually going to go through this generative AI phase and realize that everything on the internet is untrustworthy, or is it only like our generation and younger? Like, do you think our parents' generation could legitimately like transition within 6 months to understanding the context that like you have to snoop everything you see to be true or false? Like, I think the examples everyone talks about is that like it's hard for these people to adjust to like algorithmic timelines, fake media and stuff in the same way that younger people are. But do you think video is a different medium in that regard?
Yeah, I think video is a different medium in that regard. I don't know if it changes that fundamental dynamic. I think qualitatively the dynamic is probably the same, although we know that video emotionally engages people differently. And I think also tends to be, well, it depends on the video, but it can engage people to a much greater degree than just static, photos. But yeah, my gut is to buy into the basic idea, which is that older people, I'm thinking of my parents right now.
Yeah, I'm not that old. Not like old people. Like people that still are very functional and normal.
They're just, look, you see, I think I forget if I've said this on our show before, but I've certainly said in person before that content, if the question is, because we've shifted now, at first we were talking about the economics of this stuff and how economically disruptive it'll be. Now we're talking more just about societally, politically, epistemically, how disruptive is it going to be. Younger people have been acculturated for a long time now to having a kind of ironic attitude towards a lot of online stuff. Not necessarily because it's AI generated.
I don't think it's necessary. That their attitude may not be good, but continue. Like, that's a separate debate.
I'm not saying it's good, but I think
I've never heard that argument. I'm just saying I've never heard that argument. We can come back to that.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that if I were to speculate a bit about what I think the reason for that is, it's that content generation, not due to like AI, but just due to like like memes. It just has become so cheap and easy to generate content and put it online in a way that it could get engagement.
I'm mostly thinking about like how these people, the most common career that people want from seeing all this content is to be a YouTuber or a TikToker. And these career paths are not fundamentally differentiating based on like hard skills. It's differentiating on like ability to be like a personality that is rewarded by the algorithm. And I think picking your career path on something that is sensitive to the algorithm and the fact that that's popular is wild, because that is such a hard hustle life that people don't want to like the weirdness of those incentives to compare to what used to be popular in American society, like couldn't be a bigger shift. And I'm just like, people need to, like, I know there's a lot of people that are like, oh, the Gen Alpha's totally effed, they can't read, but like talking about the incentives of these generations is also important to showcase that like there's big problems here.
Right. So there's the incentives question, the fact that younger people are, we are hustling because we're career driven and we're still trying to like climb. And if AI or algorithms are changing the game of that rewrites the rules by which we hustle. There's also just the cognitive dimension, which is, old people, they're just slower. I live in New York and I'm biased now, but like, I know I become a New Yorker when I'm like behind somebody on the sidewalk and I'm like, God damn, this person's just fucking slow.
Yeah, that's brought that energy to California.
It's just because they're old, and it's not. Yeah, it's like yes, you're a citizen, and yes, you have the same rights I do, but God damn, you have to be it's slow. On this, it's just the pace of life is different. And so I think when the pace of life is different, and also, those people truly, this is the more sort of media side of the argument. They really did grow up in a different media environment than we did. They were not media saturated in the way that we are. Media generation was not as cheap. It was not as prevalent. It was not like we grew up, you and I, like grew up in a world that's still like an order of magnitude or more less media saturated than what people are growing up with now.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is the fact that we know, you and I both knew growing up. We just sensed it. It wasn't even conscious, that there was always going to be 100 times more content out there than we could consume, even if all we did was consume content.
Yes, this is why I don't. I read like no papers. I read like no newsletters. It's like,
well, that's gotten worse over time because it's only gotten cheaper and cheaper, and it's been easier and easier.
It's so far that it wasn't even a cost thing. It wasn't possible for previous generations. Previous generations' content was filtered by geographic and physical constraints, and now content is filtered to personal taste, and that is a extremely different thing. And I think video really completes that arc, where like. Video content didn't really exist. I mean, it existed on like over the air, you had a set number of channels, cable stuff. And now it's like there's effectively infinite video that can be tailored to an individual's tastes, which is like, this is like the completion of the arc of, you kind of have infinite video and you have infinite agents that are tunable to people's tastes. Like that's the last thing that you could kind of come up with in a zero marginal cost content world.
So we're not right. I mean, we're maybe still a little bit out from a truly interestingly dystopian future where there will be entire seasons of Seinfeld that I've seen that you haven't because I had them auto-generated. And like I've been on like an emotional journey with shows, with books, with movies, with music, whatever. That is, just my own spirit animal, my own spirit journey. And that's another side of this that also needs to be considered. I think the way I would sum this up, though, is like when it comes to the history of media, it is true that during periods of, and we don't really know where this is going or exactly which analogies are warranted here, but like when you think about what did the emergence of the printing press do to late medieval, early modern Europe? Right. Some historians argue that the emergence of the printing press is actually, that is the demarcator between the Middle Ages and the modern period, that it's not the fall of Constantinople and it's not whatever. It's really literally just something as banal.
It's a very techno-optimist angle, but I agree.
Well, it doesn't have to be optimist. I think it's just the disruption. It's just the fact that it became so cheap to mass produce text and information. Like if that's the demarcator, then it is bizarre though it may seem, this week may have introduced a new epoch of human history in the sense that these new models are affected. It sounds silly to say it, but yeah,
it's so telling that it's like a world that I don't want to live in. Like I don't want video tailored to me because I know I'm going to be so susceptible to that. It's like not that hard to know that I like endurance sports, Formula One, and like cool science things. It's like it's not that hard to come up with near infinite content, and it's just crippling to be able to plug into that at zero cost all the time in terms of like personal volition. Like it will destroy my personal volition in some ways, or just constantly be detracting from it.
I'll have to play a little bit fast and loose with history here, but whatever. Our podcast is not really meant to get us
we are the
awards
ground truth.
So I think that the printing press analogy is interesting, and it's worth sitting with. And I think I've already basically said why I think that is. So I'll stop there. But I think another really important historical parallel here, which I've also written about in more of my work, and which I think actually is going to matter more in terms of how because this is effectively here. Like, we're not just going to make it so that, like, okay, once we have this, it's not going to be like, now let's just not do it. Like, crack cocaine still exists. Once it became possible to, like, easily mass distribute crack, that just becomes a problem for society that is basically going to exist as long as the supply chains that can underpin that kind of production continue to exist. So we will have to reckon with this. I think the clearest parallel historically to the problem you just raised, which is how can we say no to these new kinds of poison that define our lived experience, or in this case, our media experience? Like, this is public health. This is the domain of public health. And if you look at the history of public health, the different periods when there was a need for it, it usually was induced by some new kind of technological development that caused people to cohabitate with each other in unsustainable and unprecedented ways, and that there were then indirect consequences of that, like epidemics of cholera or typhus or tuberculosis, or the Cuyahoga River catching fire in the 20th century, factories being put right next to giant rivers whose water was now no longer not even potable, but flammable, actually. And what there needed to be was a reappraisal of the environment of cities, the environment literally in the sense of the ecosystem, and what new kinds of mechanisms or means of control were needed to regulate that environment at a level of abstraction that we previously didn't have to worry about. It's funny, actually, when you and I were at RLDM or 2 years ago, I guess it was, because it was at Brown, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot we did on that trip, which is not relevant here, but when I was on that trip, I was up late at night reading about the history of public health, about the history of specifically 19th century.
I remember talking about this, at least it's vaguely familiar.
Well, because the point there was, and this is what needs to be emphasized, I think. Cholera, typhus, the plague, these were not new diseases. The actual pathology of the disease was not new. The ancient Greeks were aware of these diseases. They had their own means of, treating them that actually were fairly effective on the individual level. But what was new was the fact that these diseases were simultaneously, almost overnight, ravaging entire populations of people, because people were living differently than they did in the ancient world. Cities had never been this big. They'd never been this dense. They'd never been, industrialization was this entirely new way of being. And it basically turned cities into a tinderbox for the spread of disease. But there did end up being solutions to that. They took decades to work out, but the names of those solutions are things like epidemiology, sanitation systems, germ theory, randomized control trials.
I love
all
germ
those
theory as a field.
Yeah, germ theory, right. You point microscopes at shit that's really small until you find the little fucker that gives you cholera. Because that was a revolutionary idea. People, and actually the Greeks thought this, they were dumb. They were wrong. But people up until the 19th century, the consensus expert opinion was that disease was caused by what they called miasma, which is another way of saying when things smell bad, you have a greater propensity to get the plague. Right? They thought that somehow the air, the effluvium of the air, was just the medium
Classic
through which disease.
Versus causation.
Yeah. Well, they didn't have tools, to measure anything else, and they also didn't understand how to isolate the variables. And it wasn't until, and this is not a Game of Thrones reference, but there was this other guy named Jon Snow in Victorian London who did the first, it wasn't technically a controlled experiment, it was a very brilliantly constructed natural experiment in which he was able to isolate neighborhoods where there were outbreaks kind of artificially relative to where they got their water. And he was able to find a correlation between the water supply and cholera outbreaks that was so prohibitively strong that every other possible explanation basically fell in the dust. And so anyway, my point here is just to say, to your point, as an individual, you can't resist videos that have been auto-engineered specifically to appeal to your entire life trajectory and your sense of purpose and meaning. Look, public health tells us that that's not a new problem, because it's not, the nature of that problem is so intense and dynamic and structural that it can't be the responsibility of individual people to solve it or to deal with it on their own. We need new institutions, new methods of measurement and assessment at a higher level of abstraction to make it so that the downstream impacts of the use of these technologies is at least able to be monitored, and also that policy can be set around it so that the effects are not prohibitively bad or toxic.
Yeah, now that you're warmed up, let's move on to a potentially more sensitive generative AI topic. There's a popular image going around with this new Gemini release. The Gemini 1.5 models essentially are better models, much longer context length, cheaper. Google's doing well in base model land. We could come back to long context length, but on this topic of generative AI, one of the things that's going viral is this clip where you ask Gemini to generate me historically accurate images of kings in the Middle Ages, and one of them is black. And it's like,
I regret not having seen this in advance. This is quite funny to me.
And it's like, who should be today? I understand why Google does this. Like, the machine learning models are biased to showing what is on the internet, and they have a propensity to show white people in many situations and to reinforce many social biases, like a doctor being male rather than female. And then it's the thing of like, to what extent socially should we be okay with controlling of information? So like, as generative AI becomes the backdrop of the internet, and most of the data is generated by generative AI, it's like, how big of an issue does this type of thing where it's going to rewrite history in some way become? I think this is like, it's benign enough that it's an interesting example. There are more harmful examples in the past, I think. It's like, what's your take? I could pull up the image while you're looking.
I'm curious to see it, or you can direct me to it. It follows, I think, from what I've already been saying, right? Which is, up until now, look, I think we all know this, but it's uncomfortable to really take responsibility for it. But that's actually the moment that we're facing. The reality that we actually have to be responsible about now and own is the fact that for the first 20 or so years of its existence, but certainly in theory, and I think to a large extent in practice, the internet and everything on the internet was supplied by people as if they were individuals. Okay, so we think about content rights, we think about license agreements, we think about, just in the back of your head, these fantasies of like what the internet was like in the 80s or the 90s, of like weirdos obsessed with cyberculture who were wanting to find user forums for communities of people that were kind of like them. And it was sort of like a matching function. Like the internet was just a way for you to find your folks. The internet is not like that anymore, to put it mildly. The internet is infrastructure. The internet is maintained and supplied, which is really what you're talking about now, is that there's a new supply base for it by a very small ecosystem of players. Generative AI in that regard is kind of doubling down on and maybe cementing that reality, which has been kind of incrementally playing out for some time. I mean, even just forget AI for a second. Like, even just think of like the history of Twitter right now, right? Twitter in 2009 was seen by many people as like the future of democracy. I literally remember when there were these major protests that happened in Iran, I believe in the summer of 2009, and against the government. And again, I'm not an expert on the details here. I've never been to Iran, so I should clarify that. But what I remember at the time was that for whatever reason, much of the protest movement in Iran was coalescing and sharing information on Twitter.
Yeah, I remember
that this was apparently so significant that the White House personally petitioned either, Jack Dorsey or other executives at Twitter to delay maintenance of their servers, so that there were particular windows of time when these protesters kind of effectively relied on Twitter to coordinate their information and also just like their strategies for what they were going to do the next day. And it would, again, to such a degree that it became kind of in the national security interest of the United States to affect when that stuff was going on. Think about Twitter now relative to that.
It's
okay.
Rough. ML Twitter is like run by a bunch of anon accounts.
I mean, again, I have an account. I don't really spend time on it.
It's good that you don't. I think I sent you some links to examples with this kind of like Gemini rewriting history stuff.
Like
I don't know how it is to access the chat. I could try again some other way.
Oh, you put it in the chat. Yeah, we're using this like interface.
We
here.
use a special Descript product, not sponsored. You can sponsor us. But
this is really funny. This is funny. I'm looking.
There's so many examples. This article is looking at. It's just like,
I like how it says certainly. Here is an image. That's the part that cracks me up.
Yeah, I mean,
here are some images featuring various genders and ethnicities. Yeah, this is good. I like these. These are cool, actually.
I like AI generated art is cool, but like this is an important point where a norm is going to be defined that I think a lot of people will push back and be like, okay, like, please fix the bias problems, but don't push them in our face. Like, I don't want these models to, like, I do want there to be understanding of the algorithmic and like data structures that are causing these biases and to mitigate them. But this is just like, okay, like, you're just gonna nuke your reputation if you keep putting these into, like, this is effectively going to be like what Google is marketing as like the replacement to Google search. It's like, it's not going to work.
Yeah. So sorry, like, do it. I don't understand, why are people upset about this? These images are just cool to me. Like, I don't see why people are upset about this.
Essentially that they're not historically accurate.
Well, yeah, and is this just
I do
Twitter?
think people
like,
are...
who are the people upset about
yes.
this? Okay.
I mean, like, these images are coming from Stratechery, which is one of the like highest profile tech analysis blogs out there.
So this person who said generate a famous 17th century physicist, what were they expecting that the only right answer to that was?
This
what?
is after they're already biased.
Galileo?
They're already, yeah,
like,
I mean, they're looking, they're
Galileo or I walk.
Like, it's a biased exercise. It's not a fair exercise.
Look, AI by definition is it's an amalgam. Okay. So like, it's interesting, I guess, because it's not a one-to-one replacement for search in that regard, right? Like, if I searched Google for famous 17th century physicist, it's not going to show me hyperlinks to brown people, presumably. I mean, I'm guessing that.
I'm doing it right now.
Myself. Yeah, do it right now. See what it says.
What is the Google image? The Google image result is exactly what you would expect. It's all like faded paintings of like white men in wigs.
Well, but the thing is, that's frankly more accurate to the search.
Albert Einstein has a surprisingly big part in 17th century physics searches.
I mean, yeah. Well, that's just, yeah. I mean, it's, what are people, look, I think a lot of this is just, AI does not replace knowledge. It doesn't replace encyclopedias. It doesn't replace, it's a different kind of tool. I think that maybe we're still using, the metaphors we've been using to talk about it and think about it are a little bit off base with respect to what it actually can do.
This is
which
like
I
the
think
Jan LeCun
is fine.
It's like Jan LeCun's critique of all this is like, it's not grounded in anything, therefore it's not going to be real, and therefore it can't build the highest level of trust that people want in most of their systems.
Well, I think I agree with that. I thought it's kind of a platitude, but yeah. I mean,
I mean, Jan speaks in platitudes. He's hilarious. I don't know what
it seems kind of obvious to me.
I'm going to meet him when I'm in New York for this event in a couple of weeks. He's at that event. So I'd be like, hi,
if
want to come on the pod?
Like, yeah, we could invite him. I don't know. I supposedly, I think I bothered him with my previous, like, that article where I was quoted saying that machine learning is alchemy.
He's forgotten.
I'm sure he's forgotten. Yeah. Yeah. I think we need to, this is an invitation. Look, I would rather, to return to your original prompt, I would rather OpenAI did basically nothing. And I would rather other people who know what they're talking about to help craft a more accurate semantics to talk about what these fucking things are doing, rather than acting like in this one-to-one way, they're either going to replace filmmakers or Google or whatever other existing interface.
It's like Google,
we happen to be
OpenAI is like no longer doing nothing though. They're like making deals with media organizations, and like I think that is like deeply muddling their direction, even though it may not feel
it's
like
alchemy again. That's alchemy, because they're interested in transforming the interface through which this stuff can get accessed and thought about, rather than advancing the conversation or the science of what it would actually mean to use this stuff. Those are different projects. And, I'm not casting blame exactly. Like, if I were OpenAI, I'd probably be doing the same things as them in a self-interested way. But is your goal to help us deliberate more clearly what is going on? Or is your goal to mystify us by inundating us with what these things can do? Those are just not the same thing. We talk about them as if they're kind of are, and they're just really not.
Yeah, it's like Sam Altman raising $7 trillion. A lot of very reasonable people that I know are like, I'm not even going to comment on this. Like, it's just useless. Like, I'm not going to comment. Like, that's not a real rumor.
It isn't clear. I think there's a through line here, which is that it's not clear what actually is the reality that corresponds to what like is coming out of these models or coming out of the people who build these models. We don't really know where these things are in social space. Like, so we don't know what they stand in relation to. $7 trillion. What is comparable to $7 trillion? Because if you can't name anything, it's not really clear what that means. It's just an arbitrarily larger number than 6 or 5 or 4. Like, what is the next most valuable thing in the world after a $7 trillion valuation? I don't even know. I could guess.
It's Apple plus Microsoft, or it's Apple plus Google plus NVIDIA.
Right. So it's like all other major
like
tech
the
companies.
Tech economy is
the entire tech economy. Right. and even that is just market cap. So it's
which
not
is not
like
real
that's
money.
which is not real money, exactly. So like it's $7 trillion is just literally speculation on top of speculation. Right. And it's not so what credence should you give it? It's not intelligible. I'm not saying it's bad or good. I'm saying it's not even wrong.
Yeah. Okay, earlier I told you I had an announcement. My announcement is today that I opened the Sutton Bartow book that has been steadfastly holding my microphone for weeks.
You opened it?
Yeah,
You've
did.
never read it?
No, I've read it, but I haven't read it in months. But essentially, yeah, so Google released their new open source model, and they've confirmed that they use the reinforce algorithm for their RLHF stuff. Which the why this is funny is because reinforce is just policy gradient with the fancy name. Like, I don't know why, some guy in the 90s wrote a paper. It's like, we call these the reinforce algorithms when it was policy gradient. And I just find it fun because, like, RL is just going backwards in time rather than forwards. Like, everyone's like, PPO, and now it's just like, we just use policy gradient, big number, good. But I mean, like, the paper doesn't have that many details. I think if I comment on it more, it's mostly going to be about that, like, interesting RL history and how we're going backwards, and then I think people will go forwards from there, which is like, what is the modification of reinforce that's needed? Because PPO is downstream from it. It's just like PPO is with regularization. Reinforce is just like out of the box version.
So wait, what did you learn from Sutton and Bartow? Or did you just...
I was just reading about reinforce.
Going back to basics.
Yeah, I was just reading like this. It's old enough that it's in the textbook. Like PPO and TRPO and all these modern algorithms aren't in the textbook. But it's just fun that it's like, I can just read about vanilla policy gradient and it's in this book that I have sitting on my desk. But Google's model ultimately is like better than this Mistral 7B model that everyone's hyped about, which is why it's so funny. It's like, it makes me really vindicated, where I'm kind of like, yeah, we're all bad at this in the open, and these people like OpenAI and Google are running laps around us, but like they just don't release anything, so it doesn't really matter. So we're like doing our own thing. And this is what, if like Google and OpenAI start playing in the open, it's just going to be like a hilarious effect, which is good. It'll pull people forwards, but it's a good reality check for people that Google can just release like an intermediate training run, and it's better than the startup that's like, ooh, Mistral is this French god startup. Google just is like, oh, here's a training side effect. Like, have fun, go crazy, guys. Like economies of scale.
Economies of scale. I mean, this is a theme of, we've brought this up before, and obviously you're, a contributor to this conversation. I still think that this ongoing consternation of like, what does openness actually mean, seems relevant here, right? So like, pushing the conversation forward is one thing. I don't want to use the word democratize. I really try and avoid using that word all the time.
I've stopped using it as well.
Well, but we need a better word for what that word I think has been trying to capture, which is something like
inclusivity.
I don't know if that's the word either, but it's better. Well, the thing is, here's what's wrong with all these words, because I think both those words are better than democratize. But what's still wrong with those words is that they're ignoring the fact that the criteria for what is made transparent to whom, or what is to be included in relation to what, remains implicit. You're just making an abstraction out of what is really a relational like entity instead of sticks. Like, this is sort of what, there's a good paper actually by a friend of mine who I did a postdoc with, Emmanuel Moss, and a few other people on this paper, that articulates like the way in which we've always talked about AI accountability or ML accountability is kind of bullshit, because accountability is a relational property by definition. Something is accountable to something else. So if you're not able to specify what is being held accountable to whom or to what, it's not accountability. It's just a branding kind of initiative. And I actually think that's it's a simple argument, but it's a profound one. And it actually underpins a lot of these other abstractions that we often use, like transparency or inclusivity, because you end up deferring the stakes because you're just sort of paying this kind of kabuki theater justice to an abstraction and washing your hands, when what actually needs to be done is holistically assess what kind of conversation is the one commensurate with democratic norms.
Yeah,
and democratizing is not a good way
like what
to capture
LNAI is doing is the closest of any. But like what Google is doing here is really just like hype building. They're open sourcing this model because it's very easy for them to, or they're openly releasing the weights. It's not open source. They're releasing it because it's easy for them to do, and it's great for the narrative. Google back on top and AI, baby. Woo! like they're literally just like their numbers are the best in open and in closed, and they're like, this is great for marketing. Look at us. So you could come to Google and do open ML research. Like, they're probably like almost all like why is Google doing this? They're doing this for marketing, to have people help them with their models. Like, there's no business model moat for them dropping this thing. It's all like, I mean, no direct. It's all indirect, which I think
it's bread
matters.
It's bread and circuses, right? It's bread and circuses. Okay, making it easier for anybody in ancient Rome to attend gladiatorial arenas at the Colosseum does not change who the emperor is. Right. I mean, that's getting like expanding the seating at the Colosseum so that more people can see a gladiator get his head chopped off by a tiger or something does not in any way change the outcome or the criteria by which outcomes are assessed, right? That famously, it's a podcast, you can't see what I'm doing, but it's a thumbs up, thumbs down.
We are on
classification.
YouTube. You can follow the Retort AI podcast on YouTube and see our okay quality reacts and sometimes distract in Google searching. FYI, like and subscribe.
I'm probably thinking of this because I should rewatch. I've been thinking about rewatching the movie Gladiator.
I've rewatched it. It's been on like Netflix.
Yeah.
Or something. Yeah. I mean, I've watched it.
Does it hold up? I'm not. Yeah.
I
think it would. Yeah. It's a good movie. I remember it's a good movie. No, but of course the whole point of that movie is that he is able. What I liked most about it from years ago when I saw it is that like he becomes a gladiator, of course, but then he like kind of plays this kind of subtle game of like manipulating the optics of how he's a gladiator to kind of wrest power from a very corrupt, fucked up emperor. And that's kind of where the story goes. And I mean that we can't play that kind of game in AI right now. We're just too focused on like making the stadium bigger or improving the seating.
I do think there could be economic value from this model that Google is giving away for free with a relatively okay terms of use. Like, people could deploy this model into somewhat useful products. As like these models,
sure.
I was saying like the 7 billion parameter model scale is kind of like the sweet spot where like almost anyone could run inference. Like, you could probably do it on your MacBook and not be awful. A lot of people, academics, can do research on it. It's good enough that for really basic tasks, you'll be able to do things that are reasonable. It's like, it's kind of this economic sweet spot right now where like so much is possible with it. So like they are giving up. It's like giving up it's like a charity cookie. It's like a charity cookie that they know won't disrupt their emperor. It's like when the emperor pays for, I don't know, they fill up the Colosseum with water so it's nice and people can come and get free bread or whatever. Like in the Gladiator movie, they literally talk about it. Like, this is like, that would be the favorite emperor. I'm going to give them like a week of game so big that anyone has never seen. Like, that's like a third of the plot point. And it's like, for Google, it's kind of an apt analogy. It's like, it doesn't affect them at all, and it makes people like them. And that, I know, but right now will boost the stock price.
Commodus is also like in love with his sister and like doing all other kinds of crazy ass shit. He's not a good emperor. Even his dad is like,
well, we're not getting to the fact of whether or not we think Sundar should be resigning over his AI strategy for Bard.
Sundar. Yeah. I don't want the takeaway here to be that I'm comparing Sundar to the Emperor Commodus.
Sundar is like an actual like good like functioning CEO. Like he's done great overall.
I do actually think we need better leaders like in this space. Like I'm not anti CEOs. I'm not like some kind of weird asshole who thinks that there just shouldn't be private enterprise. I think my point is just we need to like be aware of like what are like imagine you're a superlative CEO. What decisions are you actually faced with that could meaningfully open up access to AI tools? And so far, it seems to just be branded circuses, and maybe you get a little bit of economic value on the side, which I want CEOs to be in the position where they have actual levers to pull that would make a difference. But they're as constrained as the rest of us, ironically. They're playing the rules of a game that are pretty ossified and pretty structured to favor or not favor certain types of market dynamics. And until those dynamics can change, I don't care if you're Marcus Aurelius, you're not going to be that good of an emperor.
Are you going to get a comment on if Sam Altman would be a good emperor?
Yeah, I don't think Sam Altman can't even lift.
Oh yeah, we already established this.
I'm on the record saying that $7 trillion asshole. He can't even say how much he bench presses. We need to get Sam on the pod. Sam, how much can you actually bench press?
Do you think he can bench press more than us? He might. Like I'm like a scrawny endurance athlete.
He looks like Tweety Bird, so I think he can bench more than either of us. Like it's hard, honestly, it's hard for you to even take it. Whenever you see any photo of this guy, it looks like it somehow looks like he like somehow like siphoned muscle mass from his legs and put them into his biceps.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't almost.
It's a look. It's a fashion style.
Well, it's I guess. Well, if what he's after is fashion, that's one thing. He probably still can lift more than me, but until he can be honest about what he lifts, I'm skeptical. I need to see it.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, we covered a lot. I'm sure there'll be more to talk about next week.
Yeah, at this rate. We probably already missed something while we were recording.
At this rate, yeah, we should. It's okay. We'll be on the interwebs. We'll check it out.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. Review, whatever.
Like and subscribe.
Share it with friends. Clip us. Post it on TikTok.
Clip us. Get seats at the Coliseum while they're still open.
Yeah.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye.